TKO Boxing with Sherry Abbasi, joined by a very special guest from stateside, renowned boxing journalist, Mr. Dan Rafael. Dan, thank you once again. I know we've been trying to get this over the line for a few weeks now. I appreciate your time tonight. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's my pleasure to be with you. And I know we were trying to get this done, and then you went off and went and spent a few days in Saudi Arabia to cover the fights that were recently. So it's good to be with you.
Okay, thank you, Dan. I really appreciate your time. I think the best place to start, Dan, is there actually, since it's such a monumental occasion for boxing, and potentially opening up the whole that part of the world, essentially in Saudi Arabia. As we know, Fury and Ngannou opened up Riyadh season for 2023-2024, but this seemed like the first proper hardcore boxing event where we just had a stacked card from top to bottom. Some fights were, considered mismatches on the way in, but we still had big names on there, world title fights. And then also a majority of the card was heavyweight based, essentially. What was your sort of take on when the card was announced? And we can sort of touch on the post-fight after that.
Well, I thought when the card was put together, I thought it was terrific. You say in terms of like Fury and Ngannou, that was the type of fight that was, it was interesting, even if you're just a diehard fan, but obviously they were looking to appeal to a more than just a boxing audience with the inclusion of Ngannou. And, a little bit, I don't mean this in a bad way. I just can't think of a better term. A little bit of like a sideshow sort of, because of the MMA versus boxing crossover, with solid fights on the undercard. But like you said, for this fight, this card, much more for the diehard fan stack card. And, when you have 8 fights, the fact that there might be a couple of mismatches, that's not anything unusual. You can never predict how fights are going to happen. And on paper, there was a couple that maybe were a little shaky, but by and large, it was a very solid show. And very rarely do you get an event with 8 fights in a row that are all 50-50 fights. It's just not brilliant. I thought the price point was proper for, at least in terms of the American pay-per-view, was $39.99. A lot of the bigger pay-per-views, including the Fury fight, run in the 70s. That fight with Fury was $84.99. A lot of the big, more big-time fights, whether it's Ryan Garcia and Tank Davis or Canelo fights, things along those lines, you're talking, $80, $85. So the combination of the level of fights on the show, the number of fights on the show, and the price, I thought it was, if you're a fan, how could you not buy it? And that was my thought. And it turned out to be really interesting. Big upset with Wilder, tremendous performance from Joshua, some spectacular knockouts, talking about Opetaia, some fun action fights like Daniel Dubois against Big Baby Miller. So, I was very satisfied as somebody that spent my own money to watch the show.
I think, like you said there about value for money, stateside, we always see that your pay-per-views are significantly more than what we pay here. If you look at the conversion rate and everything as well, it's still more money. So I think value for money was key with this card, and that was something that the Riyadh season organizers made a push for, that we want to make it affordable and we want as many people to tune in and enjoy the event as possible. One thing I found out there in Fight Week was that they're actually very, very serious about what they're trying to do in terms of opening up Saudi Arabia as a serious player when it comes to boxing matches and putting on the best fights. It is obviously a fairly new region in terms of having the massive fights there. We saw 2019 Ruiz Joshua, the World Boxing Super Series had the final there for Callum Smith and George Groves. And we saw Usyk Joshua, and I think Amir Khan was meant to fight another opponent who got into a car accident and ended up fighting Billy Dib back in 2019. So there's only been a few sporadic events here and there, but now they're making a big push to make it a new Las Vegas or competitor to Las Vegas in a lot of ways. But it's definitely, it's good to see we have a new competitor, because it creates more competition for the sport. Same way more broadcasters, more promoters creates competition. It allows the sport to thrive more. What do you think of Saudi Arabia making such a big push? And is it a plus or a negative for the sport overall?
Well, if you really just look at what's occurring, and if you put all the politics aside and all that sort of stuff, and you're just looking at what's the event we're going to be presented with, I guess you'd have to say it's a good thing. And the simple fact is they're able to put together the biggest fights. Fury versus Usyk didn't come together in London or New York or Las Vegas. And the card they just had with Wilder and AJ on the same card with a signed contract to fight each other. Obviously, Wilder lost, but the fight was made. That fight has been going on 5 years without being made in the United States or in London. So from that standpoint, I guess it's a good thing. They've got the money. They're not afraid to spend it. There's a very strong likelihood that they will make the next Joshua fight against, whoever it may be. Perhaps Hrgovic for the vacant IBF title when that becomes vacant. Maybe some other big fight. There's a lot of discussion that they will finalize a fight between Arthur Beterbiev and Dmitry Bivol for the undisputed light heavyweight title. Bivol won his fight on the card on the 23rd. Obviously, you have Beterbiev has to take care of his business against Callum Smith coming up in a few weeks. But I'm pretty confident that if he wins and all that, then they'll make that fight too. So, again, if you just look at what they're actually delivering, I think you can't be upset with that becoming a reality. Now, from my perspective, it's better to be in Vegas because it's a lot easier to travel to. But if your idea is just to see the biggest and best fights, they're delivering. How long were you out there for?
In Saudi?
Yeah.
I was there for a week from Monday through to Sunday. Yeah. Sorry, I apologize about that. Sorry, Dan. So like you said, it is a positive for the sport overall when we're getting massive fights like this. And I suppose for boxing fans, that's what we want. We want the biggest fights and we want them now. Like you said, we had a fight where we had Deontay Wilder, who has one of the biggest knockout ratios in boxing history, especially at heavyweight, during his WBC title reign, who had AJ, who had the other 3 belts. We could have had a massive undisputed title with 2 undefeated fighters, both who would let their hands go, and we'd have had a massive, an undefeated fight there. Now they've both taken losses and we've potentially missed out on that fight altogether. Do you think we ever see that fight, or is that sort of come and gone now?
I mean, it should have happened under the circumstances that you just described it, when they were both undefeated, when they both were champions, and when if their fight had happened, it would have been for the undisputed title. And if you go back and you go back at that time, there were conversations between their sides about making the fight on more than one occasion. It didn't happen. I suspect that if the folks in Saudi Arabia were around 5 years ago, the fight would have happened because they would have just said how much you need, and they would have made the fight like they're doing with these other matches. I mean, you can just tell because the Day of Reckoning card that just occurred, they put that whole thing together in a couple of weeks, where they had 8 different fights on the show, and individually, some of those bouts might have taken 6 weeks just on their own to put together, as opposed to them putting everything together in that short span of time. Whether they'll actually fight each other down the road or not, at this point, I mean, you never say never, and we'll see what happens with the 2 guys between now and when they could potentially, I guess, fight down the road. But I'm not sure the public really cares anymore at this point. That's just unfortunate, because even if it does end up happening, it's not ever going to be what it should have been. They're still the same names, but they're not the same fighters. Wilder certainly looks like he's about done. Obviously, if he's not done, he's going to have to prove that with some kind of performance that impresses some people. I had nenever subscribed to the notion that Anthony Joshua was done, because just because you lose decisions to Alexander Usyk, who is one of the best fighters in the world, who is a all-time great amateur fighter with an Olympic gold medal, like Joshua also, but in terms of his overall skills and everything he's been able to do, there's no shame in losing a decision to a guy like that. And since then, he's come back and he's won the 3 fights in a row. And even if you go back before that, I mean, anybody can get caught by another fighter. He got knocked out by Andy Ruiz, and then came back and shut him down completely in the rematch with a perfect game plan and executed it excellently. So I still think that Joshua, can do things. He may not be what he was when he was at his absolute peak, around the time of the Klitschko fight, but he's still a pretty damn good heavyweight. And Wilder was for a long time. Whether he still is, it's, again, based on what we saw, it doesn't appear that way. So if they do fight in the future, I think some people would sort of still be interested, but in sort of like in name only. But I'm kind of over it at this point, being honest.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with what you said there about Anthony Joshua, for example. Like you said, I think if you fight the top fighters in the division, you're bound to take losses. If you fight, decent fighters, at some point you are going to take losses, and especially someone like Alexander Usyk, who's a stylistic nightmare for a lot of big heavyweights, because he's naturally the smaller man with, fleet-footed, got that rhythm, southpaw, tricky. All those things were, very difficult things for Anthony Joshua to overcome. And like you said, it's not a disgrace losing to someone who is on that level. Deontay Wilder, of course, the inactivity, the 2, beatings he took ultimately against Fury, even though in the 3rd fight he showed the heart of a lion, and he put everything on the line.
Listen, that 3rd fight took a lot out of both guys, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely.
Whoever the loser was. I mean, Fury took damage in that fight also, as did Deontay.
Yeah. So that does catch up to you, like you said, the miles on the clock. the lack of activity from both. And even for Tyson Fury, for example, let's touch on what you just said there. After that Wilder fight, he's fought Dylan White, who was pretty much, not, I don't want to say he's finished, but in terms of he had that knockout with Alexander Povetkin, and then he fought Fury, after that. He got knocked out with an uppercut, which is a punch that he's been susceptible to for a few years prior to that, with Oscar Rivas and Anthony Joshua stopped him with that. I think Joseph Parker knocked him down with an uppercut. So that was a punch that he had problems with previously. And then he fought Derek Chisora, a man he's already beat twice before, who is also on the back end of his career, and he's pretty much done. And then 10 months out the ring, and look how he looked against Ngannou. So if you're not active and fighting the top competitors to keep you on your toes, you can get caught out, and that very nearly happened with Fury. So I think Anthony Joshua comes out with a lot of credit with boxing fans now in particular, because he's got 3 fights in this year. A guy who's that big with that much market value, as much as some may say he's not at the peak of his powers in terms of market value and brand name, he got in the ring 3 times this year. Jermaine Franklin, Robert Helenius, who was a last-minute opponent, and then he's fought Otto Wallin, and he's done an absolute demolition job on him. He came out from round 1 with intent, and that's what we wanted from Joshua, to get that nastiness and that combination punching back. So I think Joshua, will have that newfound confidence going into 2024. Where do you think the sort of the path now is for Joshua? He's number 2 in the IBF, so him and Hrgović potentially will be ordered when the title is vacated. Do you see him becoming a 3-time heavyweight champion, defeating Filip Hrgović in 2024?
Well, first of all, I think if the title becomes vacant, as most people expect it will be, because of the fact that Fury and Usyk have a 2-fight contract, and that the winner probably will exercise their right to a rematch, given the amount of money and what's at stake, that title will become vacant, and then it would make sense for Joshua and Hrgović to fight. Joshua would like to be a 3-time champion. He's talked about that. It's not a secret. It's obviously a big accomplishment. The title is important to your legacy. It also is not. I mean, Anthony Joshua makes tremendous amounts of money, but having the title, can add a little bit of luster to those types of events. No question about that. And Anthony Joshua has not been a guy that's ducked and avoided fighters. I mean, he's been, I believe, ready, willing, and able to fight Tyson Fury in the right circumstance, and it's really been more on the Fury side of things that have prevented that from happening for the most part. He signed on for the Wilder fight finally. And if you take a look at the fighters he has faced, he has fought Vladimir Klitschko, he has fought Joseph Parker, a few years ago. He fought, a bunch of good opponents. He fought Povetkin when Povetkin was still at the top of his game. So if they offer that fight as a vacant title fight, I believe that fight will happen in Saudi Arabia. Hrgović is no joke. He's a very quality heavyweight himself, big amateur career, Olympic medal winner, and undefeated as a professional, has some nice wins, including, I know some people think it was maybe that Zhang Zhilai should have got his hand raised that night. I personally felt that Hrgović eked it out, but whatever, it was a close fight against another top heavyweight. So yeah, I think that's an interesting fight. And I think that Anthony Joshua will go into that fight, if he fights in the manner that he fought against Otto Wallin, the other night, where with a purpose and with a spring in his step and with a good game plan and a heavy jab and not afraid to let the punches go. He's got a hell of a chance to win, as does Hrgović, who's a very good puncher in his own right, who doesn't mess around. He's a little more robotic, let's say, than Joshua is, who's maybe not himself the most fleet in terms of the way he throws his punches and all, but it's a good matchup. I'd like to see that fight. I mean, again, it's mandated. It'll be mandated by the IBF, and there's a lot worse fights you could certainly ask for in terms of for a vacant title. So, I think that would be interesting. And then if he wins, hopefully at some point, if Fury wins against Usyk, that someday they'll fight. And in the meantime, if Wilder somehow gets himself together and wins a fight or two and looks a lot better than he did in his last fight, maybe that fight will come back around. Who knows?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the card, we saw, like we said, there's a lot of heavyweight fights on there. We had a light heavyweight clash of Dimitri Bivol and Lyndon Arthur, and we also had Jai Opetaia back out after 2 months, pretty quick turnaround. What are your thoughts on Jai Opetaia as a fighter? Because right now, for me, I spent a bit of time with him and his manager out there. Very down to earth, good people, solid boxing people. And Jai he's got that mean look in his eye that reminds me of like a Josh Taylor and Terence Crawford, where it's not personal for him. He just wants to show he's the best, and he's serious about this sport to a different degree. He said that his father was a fighter and he comes from a fighting family, so he's got that in his blood. What is your opinion of Jai Opetaia, and what do you think his ceiling is? Because I think he can go up to the top 10, top 5 pound for pound if he puts on, if he carries on fighting the top fighters.
Well, we already know he's got a huge heart. The fact that he fought against Bradis with a busted jaw for basically half the fight, and gutted it out and won the title back, when he had his first opportunity to win that belt. So I'm a fan of Jai Opetaia. I've watched him before he won the title. I know he's had a top amateur background. He was also an Olympian, very young age. I think he was the youngest ever boxing Olympian for his country of Australia. He's an exciting fighter in terms of the style he fights in. I've heard interviews with him. He's got a pretty down-to-earth and kind of relaxed attitude about things. And like you said, wants to fight the best guys. Was willing to fight Bradis in a rematch that was mandated. Bradis was injured, couldn't do the fight. Bradis gave his blessing. His team said, you know what, let Opetaia go fight this fight with Lyndon Arthur. Don't sweat my mandatory. And they had promised the IBF that when Bradis is back, in the ring, they were going to do this fight. Presuming that Opetaia won, they would do the fight. I believe they said either by the end of February, by the end of March. So in my mind, it would have meant probably on the card that was Fury Usyk, or perhaps whatever show they may do in March, perhaps with Joshua. But the point is, the IBF, for their own ridiculous reasons, did not go for that. Even though neither party was aggrieved, they were still going to get their mandatory done in the next couple of months. And it's not like they were going to have Bradis fight somebody else for the vacant title in the meantime. So it was just a silly thing for them to strip him of, or not strip him, but for Jai vacated because he would have been stripped. It's sort of like, well, you're fired, no, I quit. I mean, either way, he didn't have the belt, but he's still the lineal champion. He's still the number one cruiserweight in the world. He's still willing to fight anybody. He's already got a great victory against Bradis. He scored a spectacular one-punch knockout against Zorro. Now, maybe Zorro wasn't the top-notch contender in the division, but he was an undefeated fighter. And I didn't think he was, he's not a bum or anything like that. I wouldn't be, if he had, maybe he shouldn't have been in the title fight. But again, on somewhat short notice, that was not the worst matchup you could have thought of. I mean, I have no problem with them making that match. And like I said, I'm a big fan of Opetaia. I hope he gets the opportunity to get one of his belts back. If he doesn't, he's still the number one guy. And I think that he does have a chance to go up to the heavyweight division at some point. Now, he's a little smaller than your typical, than the Joshuas and the Wilders and people like that. Although weight-wise, Wilder is not a heavyweight. He's just a very tall heavyweight. But I think he might be able to do something in the heavyweight division in the certain matchups. He's not the kind of, Usyk went up and became a dominating figure in the heavyweight division. He's not a big heavyweight either. He's just an extremely skillful fighter. This is not a knock on Opetaia, but more skilled than Opetaia. But basically, Usyk is more skilled than any heavyweight you could think of. So he's on a different level in terms of the skills. But I think Opetaia he's only 26 years old. He's got a bright future, it seems to me. And keep fighting the best guys and making exciting fights. You're going to make a big fan base and create a lot of interest in your fights.
Absolutely. And since we're touching on the heavyweight division, Dan, of course, like you said, February 17th, we've got Usyk versus Fury coming up, and it's taken a little while for the fight to actually get made. Within the space of a year, we've had negotiations falling apart, then negotiations falling apart, and then finally, like we said, because the Saudis have just put the checkbook out there and the figures on there, wherever it is, they've agreed to the fight. It's happening. Who would you favor at this point based on the timing of the fight and what we've seen in their most recent performances? Because both of them had shown vulnerabilities in different ways. Obviously, Dubois with the belt line punch, whether you think it's a low blow or a legal shot, that's a separate issue. But we've seen that, Usyk had to get off the floor to win the fight in fairly dominant fashion. Let's be honest, he did sort of make Dubois, quit essentially, as everyone says. And then obviously we saw Fury not look good against Ngannou, who's a debutant boxer, essentially. Who would you favor in the fight as things stand, and how do you break the fight down stylistically speaking?
Well, I do think that both guys have a path to victory, so to speak. They both have ways that they can win the fight. There's reasons to like each guy's potential to win the fight. In terms of Fury, look, he's battle tested at the highest level in the heavyweight division. He's big, he's strong, he's quick, he's got good hands, he's got good feet, he's got good power. To me, the thing about Fury is really what it comes down to. This is not just Fury. This is really what most fighters is motivation. Is he going to get himself in the best possible condition for the fight, mentally and physically, and really give himself a chance to be the best he can be on that night? Clearly, he was not that against like you said, a guy making his pro debut in Ngannou. I think he was at the best he could be when he fought Deontay Wilder certainly in their second and third fights. First fight, maybe not because of his own situation of coming back and trying to get back in the groove with his own issues he had been having. And Usyk, first of all, his conditioning is never an issue. He's one of the most focused and in shape kind of guys you'll ever see. To me, it's can he handle the size that Usyk presents? I mean that Fury presents. Now, when he was fighting Anthony Joshua, Joshua's really good, but he's fighting a regular sort of skilled heavyweight, no tricks. I mean, and I don't mean disrespect when I say basic, because he's outstanding at the basic, but it's a jab, it's a right hand. There's nothing tricky. Usyk's seen it all between his pro and amateur career. Yeah. Tyson Fury has more wrinkles, more things he can do. Can Usyk go to school on those? I think there's a good chance he may be able to. And certainly if you take a look at how he looked in the fight against Ngannou, terrible. The fight against Chisora, I don't even really count because Chisora was such a pretty much done fighter, and he just beat him up for, the number of rounds until they finally stopped the fight. But if he can use that quickness and he catches, Fury kind of napping in the ring, he can, people say Usyk can't punch, but I don't know if anybody really wants to get hit clean by the guy. I think that he can do some damage, and Fury's shown his susceptibility. He's been knocked down on a multitude of occasions. Like I said, I'm not ready to make an official pick here as we talk in the end of December. Fight's not until the middle of February. There'll be plenty of time for that. But I do truly believe that both of these guys have a chance to win, and that's one of the reasons why it's such an intriguing fight, because not only is it about who can be the undisputed champion, it's about a fight where you believe that both fighters can compete with each other in a serious, meaningful way and give us a good show.
Yeah, like you said, Fury's got the switch hitting, and he's shown different, sides to his game throughout his career. So we know that he's not just going to be a straightforward ABC fight for Usyk. He's going to have to try different things, and Usyk has so many different skills that he can pull out as well. So it is a very intriguing matchup in that sense. But like we said, they're both also shown vulnerability. So it is that adds another, sort of side to the fight as well.
Listen, also, Sherry, it's a historic fight. I mean, Lennox Lewis was the undisputed champion
25 years
Holyfield in 1999. Think about how many years it's been. Now, part of the reason is because as great and as dominating as the Klitschko brothers were in their day, for obvious reasons, they weren't going to fight each other when they held all the belts. So we never got the chance to have a 4-belt champion. We all knew for most of that period of time that Vladimir was number one, but there's something to be said about you are the guy, and you had not only are you the man in the eyes of the people, the media, the industry, but you got the belts to back it up. But the only thing that's unfortunate is that, yes, Fury and Usyk will meet for the undisputed title, barring a draw or some kind of wacky no contest. The winner is going to hoist all 4 belts, and one of them is going to get vacated or stripped within a short period of time thereafter. It's almost like the game, the carnival game, whack-a-mole. You finally get it, you hit the head, and then another one pops up. You can never keep them together for too long. I mean, the fact that somebody like Canelo Alvarez has been able to make multiple, I think 3 defenses now of the undisputed title is pretty remarkable, because in the 4-belt time frame where there's been guys that have won the 4 belts, that's the most defenses anybody's made, because you got mandatories, it's expensive because of sanction fees, you got obligations to make, and he's been able to keep them together. But take a look at all the other fighters that have done that. Devin Haney is the most recent example. He did it because he was going to move up in weight, so he vacated. But Usyk, when he was undisputed at cruiserweight, made 1 defense against Tony Bellew and then vacated. Terrence Crawford became undisputed at junior welterweight, never defended, immediately vacated, went to welterweight. He's got the belts now. Let's see if he can even get through. Well, he won't. Let's see if he can get through. He got stripped of the IBF title. So, Charlo situation. He was never able to defend all the belts after he defeated Castaño to become undisputed at 154. It's hard to do, but it's the journey, I guess, to get there. So we're going to see the end of that journey with Fury and Usyk, and then I guess they'll start anew with trying to put the belts back together once their fight's over with.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan. Dan, I'm just conscious of time. I know you said you needed to go, so just 2 very quick fire questions for you.
Sure.
Obviously, we are at the back end of 2023, so everyone's now looking to fighter of the year and performance of the year. So if you can give me your fighter of the year, please, first of all, and secondly, the performance of the year, and just a bit of breakdown on why that performance was so good, whichever one it is.
Well, I actually, in my Substack newsletter, Fight Freaks Unite, last night, we're taping this on Thursday, so late Wednesday night, I published my story on my pick for the fighter of the year. And listen, it was not an easy pick. There was some very worthy candidates. I went with Naoya Inoue, who, obviously anybody's picking a fighter of the year has got to have waited to see what occurred earlier in the week between him and Tapales for the undisputed title at 122 pounds. And there was other good candidates, whether you talk about Terrence Crawford or Devin Haney. I mean, those seem to be the leading candidates, although there were others also. I went with Inoue for a couple of reasons. Number one, and again, you're at the very, very top level of the sport. You got to pick hairs. You got to split hairs and make the selection. They're all worthy candidates. But I looked at what he did in doing two-time now undisputed champion of the four-belt era, doing it within the span of 378 days, went from being undisputed at bantamweight, which hadn't had an undisputed champion, by the way, in 50 years. Now, granted, that was last year. Now he goes up to 122 pounds. He didn't mess around. He didn't pick a soft touch or just cherry pick a guy with a belt. His first fight in July in that weight division, he fought the number one fighter by universal recognition, Stephen Fulton, who was undefeated, who a lot of people gave a chance to win that fight. And he didn't just win. He went in there and he just beat Stephen Fulton down and just, took care of him with ease. Like, it didn't even look like Fulton belonged in the fight. And he's a good fighter, Stephen Fulton. So he did that to win the two belts, to become a four-division champion. And he didn't then defend it and screw around. He went whoever had the belts. It happened to be Marlon Tapales, who may not have the name recognition or the big star power as some other fighters in the sport, but he was no joke either. He'd been a title holder in bantamweight division. He had defeated the undefeated, at the time, undefeated Akhmadaliev to win those belts in a good close fight. And he then, not only did he beat Tapales to become the undisputed champion, he did it in dominating fashion. He scored two knockdowns to get the knockout, and became not only the first four-belt champion in that weight class, the first three-belt undisputed champion in that weight class. There hadn't been ever in the history of multiple belts an undisputed champion in the junior featherweight division since the division was created. So there was a lot of history that he put together. And I thought, and he's a dynamic fighter. He's number one or number two, pound for pound, however you want to decide. So I went with him. And people were like, well, what about Crawford? He had that big, huge victory over Errol Spence. Well, Crawford had a great year also. He's been the fighter of the year in the past. I personally rank him number one, pound for pound, right ahead of Inoue. His victory against Errol Spence, I have described as maybe one of the best big fight performances in modern times. I mean, we went in there against a guy that was, the other king of the division and the ultimate summit meeting. And he didn't just win. He beat him down and just took him out, 3 knockdowns. And that's all she wrote in a devastating and dominating performance. Here's the big difference. He fought one time. Yes, it was a great opponent. But if you have to make the decision, I'm going to go with the guy that had the 2 big wins, not the 1 big win. So I give, in a way, a little, just by a hair, a little more credit for a Fulton Tapales year than a Crawford with the year against Spence. So you can disagree, and that's perfectly fine. But, on my publication, I make the decisions. You want to make the decisions, make your own newsletter.
Absolutely.
And Haney, he had a great year also. Lomachenko was a big time win to defend the undisputed, not just beating Regis Prograis by doing so by a shutout with a knockdown is impressive. To win a title in a second weight class. The difference, though, as good as the Lomachenko and Prograis wins are, there was a lot of people that felt like he really didn't deserve the win against Lomachenko. Personally, I scored that fight a draw. I still think that Devin is a great young fighter and had a hell of a year. But again, at the highest level, if you have to make one pick out of those 3 years, give me Inoue for the win.
Okay. And performance of the year?
Well, I mean, the thing that's interesting is when you take a look at the candidates that we've talked about who were the fighter of the year, all of them in their big win, they didn't just barely scrape by. You had, Haney in a one-sided, like I said, a shutout with a knockdown. You had the devastation that Crawford did to Spence with 3 knockdowns in a non-competitive fight. And in a way, in the 2 fights that he had, did he lose maybe 1-2 rounds at the most in those 2 fights? So those performances are spectacular. But I think if you made me pick one, I'd probably have to go with Crawford. I've said it, like I said just before, one of the best big-time performances that I've seen and witnessed and covered. I've been doing this for, nearly 25 years. I've seen a lot of big-time performances at big-time fights. I think about fights like Winky Wright against Felix Trinidad as an example. Those types of showdowns where it's like, King Kong versus Godzilla, right? 1 versus 2, or 2 versus 1, or 1A versus 1B, and one guy puts up just a historic kind of performance. I think Bernard Hopkins against Felix Trinidad, those types of fights, that's what Terrence Crawford did to Errol Spence. So I would have to give him a tip of the hat and say that was the performance of the year.
Absolutely. I think just sort of give you mine. I went with Terence Crawford for Fighter of the Year. I'll be honest with you, I'm biased because I actually flew out to Vegas for the fight for Spence versus
So did I.
Crawford. Yes, my first ever visit to the US, but I always said if that fight gets made, I've got to be there. And the whole significance of it being the welterweight division, the first.
How did I not meet you out there while you were there?
I know. I don't know what happened. I don't know. I came as a fan, to be fair. I didn't go as media, so it's probably why
Okay.
I didn't bump into you in the same areas. But I had a really good seat. Went with some friends. That was an unreal performance. You know, it was literally one of those awe-inspiring moments that you never forget because it was so one-sided after all the build-up and the potential that it had to be a really back-and-forth fight. But we just saw one guy be an all-time great fighter versus a great fighter. That's what ended up happening. And that doesn't mean Errol Spence isn't any good because he's had a brilliant run as well. But I think Crawford has really cemented himself as the greatest of this era at welterweight. So that was excellent. And Dan, like I said, I appreciate you. You need to go and do your podcast. So I just want to say a massive thank you to you for giving me a bit of time today. I do apologize about the technical issues. That was just bad luck. Everything was set up nicely. I don't know what happened. It just went pear-shaped. I do apologize, Dan. And hopefully, ideally, I'd love to speak to you again in a bit more detail once Fury Usyk is done, because then we've got something to talk about in a bit more detail, and we can talk about the next generation after that. Because once that's done, we sort of know that the titles are going to get, you know, sort of fractured, and then we've got another round robin to start there, and we can sort of dissect the heavyweight division a bit more if that's okay with you.
That sounds great to me. Pleasure to be on with you.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate your time, bro. Thank you.